The date is January 3rd, 2026, and the world has just witnessed a geopolitical earthquake that will reshape the Western Hemisphere for decades to come. In the early hours of this morning, under the cover of a moonless Caribbean sky, the United States Army executed one of the most audacious military operations in modern history. The target was the heart of Caracas. The objective was the removal of Nicholas Maduro. As the sun rose over the Avila mountain range that separates the Venezuelan capital from the sea, the news began to filter out through encrypted channels and eventually onto the breaking news tickers of every major network on the planet. President Donald Trump has announced that the United States has successfully captured the Venezuelan leader along with his wife, Celia Flores, and they are currently being transferred to American soil to face trial. To understand the magnitude of this event, we must first dissect the operation itself, because it represents a fundamental shift in American military doctrine. This was not a blunt force invasion. We did not see the massive deployment of armored divisions or the landing of tens of thousands of Marines on the beaches of La Guaira, as we might have seen in previous eras of American interventionism, like the invasion of Panama in 1989 or the Iraq War in 2003. Instead, this was the ultimate application of the strategy known as leadership decapitation. The United States military utilized a combination of overwhelming cyber warfare capabilities and precision stealth airstrikes to effectively blind the Venezuelan state before it even knew it was under attack. At approximately 0300 hours local time, a coordinated cyber attack neutralized the command and control networks of the Venezuelan air defense system. The Russian-made S-300 batteries and the radar installations that guard the coastline went dark. In that window of electronic silence, American stealth aircraft delivered precision munitions to key logistical nodes. They struck the military runways to prevent the takeoff of Venezuelan fighter jets. They struck the fortified bunkers around the presidential palace of Miraflores, and they severed the communication lines between the political leadership in Caracas and the military units stationed in the interior of the country. This paralysis paved the way for the insertion of elite special operations forces via helicopter directly into the urban center of the capital. The images that were broadcast live around the world showed American helicopters hovering low over the distinctive architecture of Caracas. It was a raid that relied on speed, surprise, and absolute intelligence dominance. Within minutes, the target was secured. The extraction was completed before the loyalist paramilitaries or the regular army units could mobilize a coherent response. This operation sends a chilling message to adversaries of the United States around the globe. It demonstrates that geography is no longer a shield and that the American reach can penetrate even the most fortified capitals when the political will exists to do so. But to view this merely as a military success is to miss the deeper significance of the timing. Historians and geopolitical analysts will note the eerie parallel between this operation and the events of January 3rd, 2020. Exactly 6 years ago to the day, President Trump ordered the drone strike in Baghdad that eliminated Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the Iranian Quds Force. The repetition of this date is not a coincidence. It reveals a specific operational psychology. It suggests a preference for initiating the political year with a decisive and irreversible action that sets the tone for the months to follow. By closing a major geopolitical file in the first week of January, the administration seizes the narrative and forces both allies and enemies to react to American initiative rather than the other way around. The road to this morning of finesse airstrikes did not begin in 2026 or even in the 21st century. To fully comprehend the gravity of this collapse, we must journey back through the turbulent history of Venezuela and its complex relationship with the United States. This is a story that spans 2 centuries of ambition, betrayal, oil, and revolution. Venezuela is a nation defined by its geography and its resources. It sits at the very top of the South American continent, acting as the gateway to the Caribbean. It is a land of staggering beauty and immense wealth, covering over 900,000 square kilometers. It is roughly the size of Egypt, or the combined size of Texas and Oklahoma. With a population of over 31 million people, it is a demographic heavyweight in the region. Historically, Venezuela was the cradle of South American independence. It was the birthplace of Simon Bolivar, the liberator, who, in 1819, founded the massive federation known as Gran Colombia. This grand experiment in statecraft united what is today Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, and Ecuador into a single powerful republic. Although Gran Colombia dissolved in 1830, the dream of a unified and powerful Latin American state remained embedded in the Venezuelan psyche. This historical memory is crucial because it explains the grandiosity of the leaders who would come later. It explains why Venezuelan presidents have often sought to project power far beyond their borders, believing themselves to be the heirs of Bolivar with a destiny to lead the continent. For most of the 20th century, this ambition was channeled into a close and lucrative alliance with the United States. The discovery of massive oil reserves in the Lake Maracaibo Basin in the early 1900s transformed Venezuela from an agricultural backwater into the Saudi Arabia of the Caribbean. American oil companies flocked to the country, bringing with them technology, capital, and cultural influence. Venezuela became the engine of the Allied war effort during World War II, supplying the fuel that powered the ships and tanks of the democratic powers. In the post-war era, it was a bastion of stability and democracy in a region often plagued by military dictatorships. It was a founding member of OPEC, using its diplomatic weight to reshape the global energy market. In the 1970s, Venezuela was pumping over 3 million barrels of oil a day, and the petrodollars flowed into Caracas, turning it into a modern metropolis of skyscrapers and freeways. But this wealth came with a curse. The reliance on oil created a brittle economy and a deeply unequal society. When the oil markets crashed in the 1980s, the illusion of prosperity evaporated. The government, which relied on oil for 90% of its revenue, was forced to cut social spending. Poverty skyrocketed, and the middle class began to slide into ruin. The anger and resentment that built up during these lost decades created the fertile ground for a revolution. It was in this atmosphere of despair that a charismatic lieutenant colonel named Hugo Chavez launched a failed coup in 1992. Although he was arrested and imprisoned, his brief televised address in which he accepted responsibility and famously said that his objectives had not been achieved en fin for now, electrified the nation. Chavez was released from prison in 1994 and embarked on a political campaign that would change Venezuela forever. He tapped into the deep vein of anti-establishment fury. He spoke to the poor in their own language. He promised to overthrow the corrupt elite and redistribute the nation's oil wealth to the people. In 1998, he won the presidency in a landslide. This marked the end of the era of cooperation with the United States and the beginning of the Bolivarian Revolution. Upon taking office, Chavez set about dismantling the old order. He rewrote the Constitution, renaming the country the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. He extended presidential terms and removed term limits, concentrating power in his own hands. But his most dramatic shifts were on the international stage. Chavez viewed the United States not as a partner, but as an imperialist predator. He sought to build a coalition of anti-American states to challenge Washington's dominance in the hemisphere. He forged a deep strategic alliance with Cuba, sending 100,000 barrels of oil a day to Havana to prop up the Castro regime. In exchange, Cuba provided intelligence agents, military advisors, and doctors who helped to solidify Chavez's control over the Venezuelan state. Chavez did not stop at Cuba. He traveled to Baghdad to meet with Saddam Hussein, breaking the international isolation of the Iraqi regime. He courted Iran, inviting the Islamic Republic to invest in Venezuela and establishing direct flights between Caracas and Tehran. He bought billions of dollars of weapons from Russia, replacing the traditional American hardware of the Venezuelan military with Sukhoi jets and Kalashnikov rifles. He opened the doors to China, allowing Beijing to gain a strategic foothold in the South American energy sector. Under Chavez, Venezuela became a hub for global anti-Americanism, hosting elements of Hezbollah and supporting guerrilla movements like the FARC in neighboring Colombia. The United States watched with growing alarm as its former ally transformed into a beachhead for its rivals. Relations deteriorated rapidly. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration was kicked out of the country accused of spying. Sanctions were imposed on Venezuelan officials. The diplomatic rhetoric became increasingly hostile, with Chavez famously standing at the podium of the United Nations and calling President George W. Bush the devil, claiming he could still smell the sulfur. Despite the political hostility, the economic relationship survived for a time because the United States still needed Venezuelan heavy crude for its refineries, and Venezuela needed American cash. But the seeds of the current collapse were being sown. Chavez used the oil windfalls of the 2000s to fund massive social programs and to buy influence around the region. But he failed to invest in the maintenance of the oil industry itself. He fired thousands of experienced engineers and managers from the state oil company PDVSA, replacing them with political loyalists. Production began to decline, even as prices soared. When Hugo Chavez died of cancer in 2013, he left behind a country that was politically polarized and economically fragile. He had handpicked his successor, Nicholas Maduro, a former bus driver and union leader who had served as his foreign minister. Maduro inherited the presidency, but he did not inherit Chavez's charisma or the high oil prices. Almost immediately after Maduro took power, the global oil market collapsed, the price of crude plummeted, and the Venezuelan economy went into a freefall from which it has never recovered. The economic implosion of Venezuela under Maduro is one of the worst in modern history outside of wartime. The GDP contracted by 80%. Hyperinflation rendered the currency worthless. The minimum wage dropped to a few dollars a month. Starvation and malnutrition became commonplace. The health system collapsed. Millions of Venezuelans fled the country, creating a refugee crisis that overwhelmed the region. As the economy died, the criminality of the regime grew. Denied access to international financial markets due to U.S. sanctions, the Maduro government turned to illicit revenue streams to survive. The United States government accused Maduro and his inner circle of turning Venezuela into a narco-state. They alleged that high-ranking officials and military generals formed the Cartel of the Suns, trafficking hundreds of tons of cocaine from Colombia through Venezuela to the United States and Europe. The regime also turned to illegal gold mining in the Amazon, destroying vast swaths of rainforest to extract gold to sell on the black market. The internal political situation descended into a dictatorship. In 2015, the opposition coalition won a supermajority in the National Assembly elections, dealing a stunning defeat to the ruling party. But rather than accept the result, Maduro used the Supreme Court, which was packed with loyalists, to strip the legislature of its powers. This led to the crisis of 2019 when the young head of the National Assembly, Juan Guaido, declared himself interim president, arguing that Maduro's re-election had been fraudulent. The United States, along with nearly 60 other nations, recognized Guaido as the legitimate leader of Venezuela. It seemed for a moment that the Maduro regime was on the brink of collapse. The Trump administration in its first term applied a campaign of maximum pressure, imposing severe sanctions on the Venezuelan oil sector and freezing government assets. But Maduro survived. He survived because the military high command remained loyal. He survived because Russia and China provided economic lifelines. And he survived because the opposition was fractured and unable to deliver the knockout blow. The years that followed were a stalemate of misery. Guaido's momentum stalled, and he eventually fled into exile. The Biden administration attempted a different approach, easing some sanctions to encourage negotiations, but the talks yielded little. Maduro grew more confident, believing he had weathered the storm. He tightened his grip on power, arresting activists and disqualifying opposition candidates. This brings us to the recent past and the return of Donald Trump to the White House. The strategic calculation in Washington shifted once again. The presence of a Russian and Iranian ally in the Caribbean was deemed an unacceptable threat to national security. The flow of drugs and migrants from Venezuela was seen as a direct attack on the U.S. homeland. The Monroe Doctrine, which asserts the primacy of the United States in the Western Hemisphere, was dusted off and reinvigorated. The rhetoric from the White House became sharper. The indictments against Maduro were updated, and the bounty on his head was raised to $50 million. The U.S. military began to increase its presence in the Caribbean, conducting large-scale exercises and deploying naval assets closer to the Venezuelan coast. The message was clear. The time for patience had run out. The diplomatic channels had been exhausted. The sanctions had weakened the regime, but had not killed it. In the weeks leading up to today's strike, there were reports of secret back-channel communications. The United States demanded Maduro's resignation and his departure to a third country. Maduro rejected these demands, digging in his heels and defiantly appearing at military parades. He believed that the cost of a U.S. invasion would be too high, that the threat of a long guerrilla war would deter Washington from acting. He miscalculated. He prepared for a ground invasion like Iraq. He prepared for a blockade like Cuba. He did not prepare for the surgical strike that came in the night. He did not anticipate that the United States would bypass his army entirely and come directly for him. The capture of Nicholas Maduro is the culmination of a decade of tension, conflict, and failed diplomacy. It is the end of the Chavista era in its current form, but it is not the end of the story. The removal of the dictator creates a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. The head of the snake has been cut off, but the body remains. The Venezuelan military, with its thousands of generals and its deep ties to criminal enterprises, is still armed and dangerous. The paramilitary gangs that Maduro armed are still in the barrios of Caracas. We are now entering the most dangerous phase of this operation. The initial shock of the decapitation strike will soon wear off, and the reality of the power vacuum will set in. While Maduro sits in a federal detention center, the men who enabled his rule are still in Caracas. The most critical figure in this unfolding drama is the Minister of Defense, Vladimir Padrino Lopez. In the hours following the strike, he appeared on state television surrounded by the high command of the armed forces. His demeanor was somber but controlled. He did not call for a suicidal war against the United States. He did not threaten to unleash the missiles that remain in the Venezuelan arsenal. Instead, he called for calm. This reaction is telling. It suggests that the Venezuelan military is paralyzed by indecision. For years, these generals have profited immensely from the corruption of the state. They are not ideologues. They are businessmen in uniform. Their primary motivation is self-preservation and the protection of their accumulated wealth. Fighting the United States military is a guaranteed way to lose everything. Negotiating a transition, however, might offer a path to amnesty. The United States is undoubtedly aware of this fracture. The strategy of decapitation relies on the assumption that once the figurehead is removed, the subordinates will look for a deal. It is highly likely that secure lines of communication are already open between Washington and key figures in the Venezuelan military. The offer on the table will be simple. Turn on the remnants of the regime, facilitate a transition to the opposition, and you might avoid sharing a cell with your former boss. However, the military is not a monolith. While the high command might be pragmatic, the middle ranks and the paramilitary groups known as colectivos are a wild card. These groups were empowered by Maduro specifically to defend the revolution. They control vast swaths of the barrios and have nothing to lose. Into this volatile mix steps the figure of Maria Corina Machado. She is the Iron Lady of the Venezuelan opposition. After years of persecution, she has emerged as the undisputed leader of the anti-Maduro forces. In 2023, after the collapse of the interim government of Juan Guaido, she galvanized the opposition base. When the regime stole the 2024 election, Machado refused to back down. She holds the moral authority that few others possess. Machado is an unapologetic ally of the West. She advocates for a free market economy, the privatization of the state oil company, and a total realignment of Venezuelan foreign policy away from Russia and China. For her plan to work, she needs to take power, and she cannot do that without the acquiescence of the military. The United States envisions a scenario where a transitional council is formed, including representatives of the opposition and technocrats. This council would govern for a specific period to stabilize the country and prepare for free and fair elections. But history teaches us that regime change is rarely clean. In 2003, the United States removed Saddam Hussein but failed to understand the internal dynamics of Iraq, leading to a decade of insurgency. Venezuela has its own complexities, a country awash in weapons and infested with guerrilla groups like the ELN. Furthermore, we cannot ignore the geopolitical dimension. Russia and China have invested billions. Russia views Venezuela as a strategic outpost, a counterweight to U.S. presence in Eastern Europe. While they are unlikely to intervene militarily to save a fallen dictator, they have the capacity to act as spoilers. They can use their veto power in the UN Security Council or provide support to insurgent factions to make the country ungovernable. Then there's the issue of migration. A violent conflict could trigger a new wave of refugees, destabilizing neighboring countries like Colombia and Brazil. The "you break it, you buy it" rule of geopolitics is now in effect. The United States, by removing Maduro, has taken ownership of the Venezuelan crisis. The economic reconstruction will be a monumental task. The oil infrastructure is in ruins. It will take tens of billions of dollars and years of work to bring production back. However, the potential is undeniable. Venezuela still sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world. In a stable environment with the rule of law, Western energy majors like ExxonMobil and Chevron would rush back in. A revitalized Venezuelan oil industry would be a massive boon for global energy security and would further isolate Russia and Iran. But getting from the chaos of today to that vision requires navigating a minefield. The regional implications of the return of the Monroe Doctrine and the use of direct military force send a shockwave through Latin America. Leftist governments will likely condemn the operation as imperialist aggression. Colombian President Gustavo Petro will find himself in a precarious position caught between his ideological sympathy and the reality of American power next door. As we look ahead, several key indicators will determine the direction of events. Will the military fracture? Will the streets of Caracas erupt in violence? The capture of Maduro is a definitive end to the personalist dictatorship, but the system he built, the deep state of corruption, is resilient. Reconciling these two Venezuelas, the one that celebrates today and the one that mourns, will be the work of a generation. The United States has rolled the dice, betting that a swift, decisive blow can break the deadlock. But as the initial adrenaline fades, the hard reality of nation-building begins. We are witnessing history in real time. Venezuela could become a beacon of freedom or a quagmire of violence. This operation forces the world to reckon with a new reality of American power. It is a power willing to bypass international norms to achieve its security objectives. It is a warning to other regimes that feel protected by distance or alliances. The long arm of the United States has reached into the most fortified bunker in South America and pulled out its enemy. The world has changed today. The rules of the game have been rewritten. As the Venezuelan people look up at the empty sky where the American choppers flew, they are waiting to see if they have been saved or if they have simply traded one form of chaos for another. The extraction of Nicholas Maduro is a tactical triumph, but a strategic gamble of the highest order. If you found this breakdown of the Caracas raid and the history of the Bolivarian Revolution essential, hit the subscribe button now. We are entering the most dangerous phase of this geopolitical shift, and you'll want to be among the few who stay ahead of the curve as history is written with fire and resolve.